Good morning, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Michelle Nellenbach. I'm the Vice President for Strategic Initiatives at the Bipartisan Policy Center, and I am thrilled that you could join us today for a conversation around competitiveness. So the Senate recently approved the Bipartisan Chips and Science Act, aimed at strengthening American leadership in global technology innovation. With hundreds of billions of dollars for domestic semiconductor manufacturing, R&D commercialization, and regional economic development, the legislation is an important moment for bipartisanship and U.S. competitiveness policy. But the work is far from finished. We at the BPC think it's a great starting point, but so much work remains. And so we're thrilled to be joined today by former Washington Governor Gary Locke, who also happens to be the former Secretary of Commerce and the former ambassador to China, to join us today to talk a little bit about competitiveness and where do we go from here. So welcome, Governor Locke.
Thank you, Michelle.
So let's just start right off. How do you define global competitiveness?
Well, obviously, there's a competition among private companies and the competition among countries to provide to ensure that their businesses thrive and that they're creating jobs for their own people. There's also a question of nationalism and national pride. But I think that in this global economy, when 97% of the consumers live outside the United States, American companies have to be very competitive in order to provide jobs for their own employees and to provide returns for their shareholders. So they need to be competitive with the companies that make products that are also trying to sell into those 97% of consumers outside America's borders. And so we need to make sure that our products are meeting the demands of consumers, high quality, low price, and that we're constantly innovating and keeping abreast and having newer models and newer versions coming out. So that means our companies have to be competitive from an economic standpoint, a cost standpoint, from a quality standpoint, and that is attractive to those ultimate consumers. And therefore, it's important that U.S. government policy, all the way down from the national level down to the local level, encourages that constant innovation and that helping our companies compete with companies around the world.
Great. So let's talk a little bit about the government role here. So throughout your career, you focused heavily on a metrics-driven approach in order to improve efficiency and increase performance, from reducing the turnaround time in government payment to businesses, to completing visa requests. You had a direct or indirect influence on the speeding up of these government actions. What are some areas we can look to improve the speed and efficiency of the public sector regarding competitiveness?
Well, obviously, siting facilities and manufacturing, whether it's large plants, the permitting process, even all the way down to affordable housing and residential units, to major industrial parks. Certainly our transportation system, it's taking us way too long to upgrade our transportation system for even just the efficient flow of goods and people within America, which impacts our competitiveness in terms of getting things from the docks and the ports to the warehouse distribution centers, or from our farms to our ports, so that they can be transported around the world. So it takes the Congress has passed legislation, provided funding. The states have increased their revenues for transportation projects. But how long does it take to get these things done? And then looking at how soon we'll be able to deploy some of the new initiatives and measures and funding for renewable energy and the siting of facilities. I think we really have to speed up our game in terms of accomplishing many of the things that the public and the policymakers have set out.
Well, and certainly with the infrastructure bill, hopefully we will get, we have the much needed investment into some of those infrastructure assets to help ease the supply chain blockages and really drive the economy the way we know it can. And now with the CHIPS Act, we'll make significant investment in semiconductors. We obviously will still have some other supply chain issues in other sectors to address. So in the 1960s, no one could envision Japan's auto industry being as competitive, let alone dominating the world market as it does today. Are we at risk of Chinese industries pushing out American industries if we don't do some of the things you just talked about?
Well, the Chinese have really improved the quality of their products, and so much of what we now consume in America is made in China. Whether it's barbecue grills and things like that, and hand tools, and a lot of it is very, very high quality, very, very high quality, low cost, which then of course frees up money in the pockets of Americans, who then can purchase an automobile or spend time on vacation or put it into retirement plans or college education for their children, or just taking care of fixing things around the house. But those Chinese products are now also being sold around the world. And if we want to be able to compete, we need to make sure that our companies are investing in the future, that our government policies support that, which means highly skilled workforce, policies that promote research and development and innovation by the private sector. There's a lot that government can do in partnership with the private sector to enable the private sector to compete globally.
Sorry, I somehow muted myself. Let's dive a little bit more into China. The rise and growth of China over the past 20 years, from ascension to the World Trade Organization to saber rattling over Taiwan recently, has deeply influenced American life in ways both seen and unseen. China's WTO entry obviously dramatically altered global trade, helping keep inflation low for Americans for years. But we saw millions of manufacturing jobs shift overseas. Was the admission of China into the WTO a mistake? And if we could go back in time and make changes, are there anything you would suggest?
No, I don't think it was a mistake to allow China to join the WTO. And as a result, as you pointed out, China has been able to export to America high quality, low cost goods, which has actually kept inflation low and improved the quality of life for the many people in America. But there have been some drawbacks and detriments. First of all, China has not lived up to all of its promises that it made when it joined the WTO. We needed, and we still must, really hold China's feet to the fire and to ensure that they open up their markets to American companies the way that we have opened up our markets to them. There's so many sectors in the Chinese economy that are off limits to foreign investment, or where investment is allowed. The foreign company, the American companies, cannot be a majority shareholder, so they have to have a partnership with a Chinese company. And after a while, the Chinese company can go off on its own and not need the support and the help and the wisdom and the expertise of the American company. So there are still many, many sectors of the Chinese economy that must be opened up, and they need to abide by the rules. These unfair subsidies and dumping of artificially low prices that some of the Chinese companies charge in selling their products overseas violate these international rules of world trade. But certainly, by allowing China to join the WTO and allowing them to sell their products around the world, it's created jobs for the Chinese people, and some 800 million people have been lifted out of abject poverty in China into a middle class. That's what we want for all people all around the world. We want people to have a better quality of life, and we should not begrudge people for wanting that. But we need to make sure that they abide by their promises and that they follow the rules. And certainly, we need to enforce those rules.
So that's a really good point about the effect it has had on the general Chinese population. You're right. We do, as a country, it is one of our values to lift everyone. But you're obviously a Chinese American. There are hundreds of thousands of Chinese Americans here in the United States, probably more than that. And the focus of the competitiveness conversation has been on China. But as we've seen, Europe, so BPC also has an ESG project. We have a technology project. We have seen the EU really target American tech companies. They are implementing some disclosure requirements for American corporations. So it's not just a China conversation. It's really more of a global conversation and how we are, help our companies compete internationally. But how do we keep the conversation at home from becoming too nationalistic, sort of addressing the rhetoric around Chinese Americans? We certainly don't want to foster discrimination of any kind here at home, but we do need to address some of the imbalances with the Chinese government.
Well, that's very much in America's interest to protect American companies, to make sure that there's a level playing field for all companies around the world, whether it's American companies competing in Europe to Chinese companies competing around the world, or certainly here in the United States, and American companies having a chance to compete, to showcase their high quality goods and product, safety, reputation in China. We need a level playing field, because that's when you don't have a level playing field, then it's really disadvantageous to so many people, not just the companies, but their employees, their workers, and ultimately the consumers. We obviously have very deep-seated differences and disagreements, concerns about China's trade and economic policies, whether it's with respect to American companies and foreign companies within China, or how Chinese companies operate with the blessings and the encouragement of the Chinese government abroad. And a lot of those companies are government-owned companies, state-owned enterprises, whether owned by the national government or by provincial, state, and local governments. We need to separate our disagreements with the policies of Beijing from how we view the people of China, and certainly Chinese Americans, many of whom are second and third or fourth generation born Americans who maybe not even speak a word of Chinese, have never even been to China. Just as we have differences with how, for instance, France or Germany may be treating our American companies in terms of antitrust laws, privacy laws, disclosure laws. We may have differences with the policies of Paris and Bonn or Berlin, but we don't take it out on the people of France or French Americans or German Americans or the people of Germany. So we need to separate how we treat people of a certain ethnic background from the policies of the governments of their ancestral homelands.
So last year in an interview with Bloomberg, you mentioned that, quote, one of the hallmarks of the Biden administration has been reestablishing relationships with our allies to address issues such as China. The go-it-alone approach has hurt our effectiveness at addressing these concerns. In the same interview, you stated the United States needs a coordinated multilateral approach with China. What does that approach look like, and what are some of the relationships we should prioritize from a competitiveness angle?
Well, I think a lot of countries around the world have similar concerns with the United States about China's trade and economic policies. But I thought while the Trump administration had the right objectives and the right motives, their strategy of imposing tariffs on Chinese products and goods coming into the United States, and we were the only country doing that, resulted in retaliation against American goods going into China, which affected American companies. The tariffs on Chinese products coming into the United States, virtually all Chinese products coming into the United States, according to from the Wall Street Journal to the New York Fed, has resulted in an increase to the average American household of about $1,000, $800 to $1,000 in extra spending for the same goods every single year. So that's hurt the American family at a time of high inflation. And when American products can't be sold or have to be sold at a much higher price in China, relative to the German product, the Canadian product, the French product, the Australian product, it puts American companies and therefore American workers at a disadvantage. And while many of our allies were rooting for us in hoping that we would be able to persuade Beijing to change and modify and correct its unfair trade and economic policies, their companies were benefiting from this unilateral trade war between the United States and China. So while the French and the Germans were hoping that we would achieve our objectives in getting China to modify its policies, their companies were getting the business. And so, if anything, we should have been joining with our allies. Just as Hank Paulson, former Treasury Secretary on the Bush administration, said, we needed a multi-country approach against China instead of just the United States alone.
Great insights. So we can't have a conversation about China and not talk about Speaker Pelosi's recent visit to Taiwan. She was the first House Speaker to visit since 1997. Before the Chinese government strongly pushed back at the visit, and afterwards conducted aggressive military drills around the island nation. What are your thoughts about the visit, and what more can we do in relation to Taiwan?
Well, first of all, I think that anytime a high-ranking U.S. government official visits Taiwan, it's going to create problems. But that's something that we have to accept. We cannot allow another country to dictate to our elected officials, and certainly members of the administration, which countries they can or cannot visit. I think it was exacerbated, the tensions were exacerbated, or the fallout and the pushback from the Chinese was exacerbated because President Xi Jinping is getting ready to be anointed by the Communist Party in a few months to an unprecedented third term, to almost a term for life, presidency for life. And so he needed to ensure that he was, demonstrating force and resolve and appealing to the nationalism within China over Taiwan. So he had to be tough. Now, I think that the Chinese government official, overreacted. They did not need to go to the extent that they did. They could have just downplayed the visit and said, yeah, we strongly object. And she's only a member of Congress, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they could have done something to push back. But they didn't need to engage in all of this, the extent of the military drills and the firing of missiles. Because what I worry about that is that it sets a perhaps new norm of provocative, confrontational actions by the Chinese. They've always been flying jets close to the airspace of Taiwan. They've brought their ships through the Strait of Taiwan as a demonstration of force and saying, hey, we're still here. Don't ignore us. Don't think that we're not watching you in Taiwan. But the way in which they've done it, is that going to be the new norm of encroachment, of proximity to Taiwan airspace or to the shipping lanes? And will that later on lead to, macho pilots, Top Gun type pilots who will bump into each other, or Navy captains who are playing chicken and say, you give way, no, I give way, or I'm not going to give way, you give way, and you have an unintended collision of ships or planes, which then will throw the region into chaos. So it's the unintended consequences of more aggressive behavior, which might be the new norm. And I worry about that.
Well, I certainly hope that is not the case, but we'll all just have to keep an eye on how China reacts to the visit, and if there's any more military maneuvers and such. I want to pivot really quickly to climate change, and then I'm going to let you jump because you've been very generous with your time. As you know, China is the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, about 30% of the world's total. If the global community has any hope of reaching the Paris climate goals, China has to significantly reduce its own emissions. Beijing announced plans to peak the country's emissions before 2030 and to achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. But they are also ramping up their use of coal. So continued investments in coal-fired generation today will make it nearly impossible for them to achieve carbon neutrality. Do you think Beijing is serious about meeting the long-term target, or was the announcement largely for public relations?
Well, certainly the people of China are clamoring and demanding a cleaner air, because when we were living in Beijing as ambassador, there was about a week of just so terribly horrid air pollution that you could barely see it across the street. And even the Chinese government newspapers finally had said that, we can't keep pretending that this is fog, that it really is air pollution. And the government has really moved aggressively in many aspects to curb the use of fossil fuels. Municipal bus fleets must all be electric. The Chinese government, yes, they are building a lot of coal-powered electricity plants, but they're also building like 5 or 6 or 10 nuclear power plants. They have more solar and wind farms than any other country in the world. Part of their challenges is hooking up those renewable sources of electricity to the population centers that need it. But they realized that they have a health crisis that's brought on by the use of coal, whether it's just in manufacturing or municipal heating. Many of the cities in the north have underground steam pipes provided by the municipal government that go into the homes that provide heat, and that all of that is generated using coal. So they know they have to move forward, but at the same time, they have 35 to 40% of the population living in the countryside, living in villages that still use wood kindling to cook, where they don't have washing machines or drying machines, and they have refrigerators the size of what you would see in a college dormitory in a hotel room. So this is the problem with all developing countries, not just China. We don't want them to use fossil fuels, but are we expecting them to keep their population poor or in living in very primitive conditions until there is sufficient renewable energy to supply electricity? China does produce more greenhouse gases than any other country in the world, but Americans produce more per person than any other country in the world. So between the two of us, the United States and China, we are the key to together solving and certainly curtailing greenhouse gas emissions. If China moves aggressively on reducing greenhouse gas emissions and the United States does very little, then China's efforts will be for naught. If we move aggressively, and if we're able to reduce carbon emissions under the new Inflation Reduction Act by 2030, a 40 or 30% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, but China does very little, our efforts will be for naught. So the entire world is looking for partnership and movement from both the United States and China. It was disappointing that China canceled their talks and cooperative agreements with the United States on climate change. They've canceled a whole bunch of cooperative arrangements, military exercises, scientific research, et cetera, over Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. But I think that's temporary. They will resume. But we need to make sure that both countries are moving aggressively on reducing greenhouse gas emissions.
Well, thank you, Governor Locke. This was a really interesting and informative conversation. Appreciate you spending so much time with us today.
Oh, my pleasure, Michelle.
Thank you. And I will now bring in our second speaker, Tom Madrecki, who is the Vice President for Supply Chain and Consumer at the Consumer Brands Association. Tom, welcome.
Great. Thanks so much, Michelle, for the invite.
So that was a great conversation we just had with the governor. Let's dive into a little bit more here about supply chains and what you're hearing at your association. So obviously the past couple of years with COVID have brought supply chain issues to the front and center of the policy discussion. What are some of the issues that are keeping you guys busy now? And can you tell our audience a little bit about what the Consumer Brands Association is and who your members are?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Consumer Brands Association represents the totality of the consumer packaged goods industry. So food, beverage, household, and personal care manufacturers, many of the most iconic brands in America. Basically, if you can find it in a grocery store or a big box store, we probably represent those brands. And those brands, of course, are the same products that early in the pandemic were so hard to find, right? When consumer demand spiked, and this is getting, I think, to the question like, well, what are some of the problems of the issues that have kept us up? It all goes back to record-breaking consumer demand early in the pandemic, and that demand has persisted month after month. In fact, even recently, it's higher than the levels experienced in March 2020 when people sort of cleared the shelves and there was panic buying. Well, today, those products are even more in demand. Manufacturers are forced to keep pace in that environment, and amid record-breaking inflation, scarce labor, challenging in terms of transportation dynamics and port congestion and all of the other things afoot in the supply chain. And that sort of perfect storm and the sort of compounding nature, not just of the pandemic, but of other disruptions, whether it's cybersecurity events, inclement weather, all of that, I think has continued to put supply chains and competitiveness really at the forefront of that national conversation.
That's a lot for y'all have to deal with.
I have 2 kids as well, so it's nothing compared to that, I guess. So.
Well, one of the solutions your organization has been pushing for, or has indicated their support for, is a new Office of Supply Chain within the federal government. The office would be responsible for the oversight and coordination of public policy affecting private sector supply chains. Can you elaborate on how this would benefit the current situation, and is there any likelihood that it would actually happen?
Yeah. So, the way I think about it, we have alarmingly little visibility to supply chains, how they function, what their relative levels of performance are. And the way that I always put it is you really can't fix what you don't understand, right? Government has to have that level of expertise, the ability to coordinate across different agencies, to be more strategic in its policymaking, really building, I think, on what the governor just shared, thinking about how do you actualize US policy to build competitiveness so that it makes a difference for consumers. And you need to have that strategic sort of think tank within government, the ability to develop new policy and to coordinate it better, and also just to, frankly, at the end of the day, understand supply chains and how they operate. One of the challenges early in the pandemic was we were often explaining just that it's all connected. It's not just a transportation problem. It's not just an economic problem. It's not just an agriculture problem. Everything in the supply chain is very much connected. And so there is no silver bullet solution, I think, apart from really raising that level of expertise and visibility as a starting point.
Yeah, that would be really critical because, as you said, these are just far more complicated issues than folks might realize, and they are impacting every industry in the United States. The chip shortage impacts cars, not just personal devices and such. So that would be it would be good to have somebody coordinating at the federal level. So the CHIPS Act that just passed did address the semiconductor supply chain issues. But there's, like you said, there's so much out there. So what does the bill miss? What other sectors should be receiving attention in the coming months and years? Is there a way to prioritize where we should focus next?
I think, unfortunately, Congress kind of dropped the ball as it relates to competitiveness and, frankly, just like building that domestic manufacturing base at home. I mentioned the Office of Supply Chain, or a similar concept. You can call it a critical supply chain resiliency program, whatever the verbiage is around it. The context of CHIPS, obviously USICA and competes, and the conference process that was taking place in Congress to move those larger pieces of legislation forward. There were provisions in both of those bills that would have established that type of program or office. So that's an immediate, shame on us for not having that lesson from the pandemic and adopting it and responding to it. But even thinking more broadly, there are also provisions that would have supported domestic manufacturing from an investment standpoint in terms of loans and grants and loan guarantees there. It's not just chips. It certainly addressing the semiconductor issue is of paramount concern from a national security perspective and the variety of political reasons that go into that. But at the end of the day, you still just need as many screws to put together a laptop. You need packaging for our industry. All of that, those other industries have to be there if you're going to have available and affordable products for consumers. It's not just chips. And so being able to really shore up that domestic manufacturing base is critical to our long-term competitiveness as a country.
So I want to get into a little bit about what exactly does that mean. So we all go into the grocery store, order something online, they either have it or the shelf is empty. And we're looking at that overall product is not there, but it goes through a long journey to get to that point. As you mentioned, there's the product itself, there's packaging, there's all kinds of stuff that goes into that. Can you walk us through what the journey looks like and how we can improve any national, state, or local factors that affect it?
Yeah. And the way that I think about it, right, is that the supply chain is both tremendously complex and extraordinarily simple, like all sort of at the same time, right? So if I talk to one of our members is Land O'Lakes, if I talk to their head of supply chain, at the end of the day, Yanni Dewberry makes a lot of butter and distributes a lot of butter. Making butter is not so different than shaking cream in a mason jar and sort of like having the whey separate. You make butter. But at the same time, that journey literally from agriculture to a consumer is intensely complicated and complex in terms of the number of steps involved, the variables, the different sort of regulatory environments that product maybe moves through, and then the impact of policy along the way. I think that, if the other thing to, at least from a consumer packaged goods industry standpoint, to mention is that we are a bit unique in terms of manufacturing. Vast majority of our products are grown in America, manufactured in America, distributed in America, and then consumed in America. So that's certainly in today's global economy unique. There are aspects to every product. Maybe there's a specific input that comes from abroad, or China, for example, and maybe we'll get into this a little later, is a particular source for some of the vitamins and stabilizers and different critical pieces of a product that would account for its shelf stableness or other aspects that are essential for that product actually making it to a shelf. So there's certainly a role for those not domestic inputs, but it's very much a domestic journey for our products by and large. Again, it's the grown in a field, purchased as a commodity, goes to a manufacturing plant, distributed to the grocery store distribution network itself, and then ultimately reaches the consumer. So it's not too challenging, but it's certainly more complex than maybe people give credit to.
Great, thank you. And I did forget to mention for our audience who's following us, we will take audience questions for Tom. Unfortunately, Governor Locke had a prior commitment, but we're going to use the chat on YouTube or Facebook, or you can do the questions on Twitter using #BPC Live, and I will turn to those in just a couple minutes. But I wanted to go a little bit more into this. So competitiveness, people tend to think of it as national security or economic competitiveness, but a lot of your members they produce food, and food is a critical part of competitiveness. It's not just it's something we just don't really think about a lot in that lens. So how do you view competitiveness, and how are your company brands contributing to our global competitiveness?
And at least to me, the thing that I see so intertwined with competitiveness is quality of life for the consumer. I think that those two run really in parallel. The other way I talk about it is that when we are addressing and fixing supply chain issues, we're ensuring the availability and affordability and accessibility of those essential products, whether it's food, whether it's soap or personal care or makeup, whatever the case is. That's ensuring that consumers have access to those affordable products. As the governor mentioned, it puts more dollars in their pocket for other things, or investing in their child's education, or it raises that standard of living and that quality of life. And if we're going to proclaim that, we're one of those leading nations when it comes to our quality of life, then we sort of have to back it up with some policies that help us get there and ensure that stability long term, because other countries are going to be making investments. They're going to be sort of designing and coordinating their policy maybe in a different way that accelerates their development. And maybe our quality of life, while we make like we're the greatest nation, is sort of like the posturing of America. If other countries have the same, if not better, then it's harder to sort of make that case, I think.
Excellent point. I do want to circle us back a little bit to where we were with Governor Locke, because you had just mentioned that some of the ingredients, if you will, are coming from China. We've seen this particularly around critical minerals, but you mentioned some other things that are in vitamins and such. What are you guys looking for in terms of the administration's approach to China and that relationship?
I mean, as the governor mentioned, I think it really comes down to a brokering of a relationship and truly fostering that level of dialogue ensuring that the commitments that are made on the part of the Chinese are adhered to, being firm, but also recognizing that so much of our supply chain is interconnected. So it doesn't make sense to sort of take punitive measures at time, enforce tariffs on a particular products or list of things that then ultimately, who really is impacted? It's the American consumer at a time of record inflation, and nobody really wins in that scenario. So I think that we need to be firm and understanding of the trade, address the trade dynamics that are there, but also I think be a little bit finer tuned or sort of aware of when we are approaching some of these thorny issues in a global economy. There is a price that's ultimately felt by the consumer.
That's a really good point, that they really are the core of all this. And as we're seeing with inflation, and people are getting hit pretty hard right now. The interesting thing about today's economy, though, is we are at near zero, or we have extremely low unemployment. So it's making it hard for folks to find workers. We've all seen delays at airports and at ports, and we know there's been a truck driver shortage for quite some time now. So how are those workforce issues affecting your industry, and what are they doing to bring in new workers who really have, it's kind of a workers market right now?
Yeah. It is the number one issue that comes up on any call I have with a head of supply chain, or even just like at a manager level or an operations level, over and over and over again. It is worker scarcity and the inability to find and attract that talent. I think that our manufacturers have taken great strides to raise pay, be more flexible about scheduling, even in environments that traditionally may not have that level of flexible scheduling. If you think about like a manufacturing or a warehouse facility, it doesn't totally lend itself to working from home or something like that. So there's, but tremendous accommodations are being made on the part of manufacturers. And yet at the same time, it is intensely challenging to fill the over 110,000+ jobs that are open in our industry. All of the open jobs, we're back to pre-pandemic levels of employment. So all of those jobs are reflective of that record levels of demand that are being sort of incurred by the industry. So that's new job growth. And we just simply can't find the workforce to fill those jobs and keep pace with demand, which is leading to some of those both higher costs as well as the sort of backlogs or delays in manufacturing, and then ultimately having a consumer see a product on the shelf.
Is there a particular point in the infrastructure that is causing some of the log jams? I'm assuming y'all are shipping across train, barges, anything you can use. Is there a particular point where they're running into issues?
Yeah, it's a pretty much all of the above situation. So the way that I sort of talk about this too is that, in America, we don't have enough trucks to move the product that we, have to move. And at the same time, that demand for trucking services is growing exponentially, in part due to e-commerce growth, some of the changes that are required there in terms of network design and how sort of more trucks now more than ever are needed. But also trucking demand is on the rise because rail performance is declining as well. So people are moving from rail to truck, and then at the same time, we're not accounting for the fact that our rail performance is declining across this country from a service level standpoint. You saw many of the port congestion issues that were rising. Maritime performance is down and also just insanely expensive. If you're an exporter, especially in the center of a country, maybe you're an ag grower or something like that, it's damn near impossible to get a container just even out the door. And so maybe you have almonds or cranberries or some other product that's basically just now rotting at a dock because you can't get it out the door. And that's just a lost sale and bad for so many reasons. But it's a really, I would say it's approaching like crisis level when it comes to really addressing some of the transportation issues in this country and what can be done about it.
Well, as we all know, Congress just passed probably the biggest investment in American infrastructure we've had in at least decades. And it was a fairly comprehensive proposal. So hopefully we will start to see some of this logjam break, but obviously the workforce issue is a huge component to that.
Yeah. Well, and I think the other thing too to mention is that investing in infrastructure is one piece of this. I think one of the other things to be really sensitive to are there low-hanging like policy opportunities to make the transportation that we do have more effective or more efficient. So Congress also just passed the Ocean Shipping Reform Act, which I think provides some much needed authorities to the Federal Maritime Commission to target some of the unfair practices, fines, fees, other issues that were sort of like hoisted on shippers by the maritime industry. But the same could be said of, there's some proposals in Congress to reauthorize the Surface Transportation Board and provide them and that regulatory authority some more teeth to address some of the rail performance issues. We could raise gross vehicle weight limits in this country and keep trucks just as safe as they are to move more product more efficiently. You could change hours of service. You could sort of go and could make trucking a more appealing profession. It's certainly not, the coolest or the sexiest profession. I don't think there's a lot of turnover in that space. So how do we get more truckers and retain the ones that we do have? There's also, I think, been some efforts around data sharing, being able to leverage data in new and innovative ways. The administration, to their credit, launched an initiative called the Freight Logistics Optimization Works, or FLOW, which is really, I think it's a much more innovative initiative than some folks have given credit to, because it's looking ultimately to leverage shared data from across shippers and logistics providers and really the whole sort of supply chain constituency, and ultimately be able to make the system work more efficiently. And we see that as the foundation for something like a national freight data portal, or some sort of a new system that could really unpack the potential of information sharing and data sharing. The way that, and this is me on my like little soapbox here, but when you democratize information in the supply chain, you're going to make that supply chain work much more efficiently than it does today. So I think that there's also some just policy opportunities to build competitiveness aside from investment, if that makes sense.
Oh, no, totally makes sense. And I think you made a really good point to demonstrate that as great a bill as CHIPS and the Science Act is, and it's a huge accomplishment, there was so much more that we need to do. And we've got to just keep pressing on our policymakers to make sure that they do some of the things that you just articulated that would help particularly improve some of the supply chain delays. I've got one more question for you, and then I know we're almost at time. So you've got a new report out, U.S. supply chain policy priorities. One of the issues is the need to attract and retain industry. So what are some of the factors that help attract industry, and what are some of the factors that help retain the industry? You'd mentioned the workers, but we've also got to keep the industries going.
Right. I mean, I think that logistics sort of behind the scenes, that is the backbone ultimately of how goods and services move across this country. And so if you're going to open up a manufacturing facility, you're going to make consumer packaged goods, you're going to open up a winery, you're going to open up a computer software business, whatever you're going to open and start a business, you're going to rely on that sort of unseen network of logistics companies and transportation providers and workforce that helps you get what you need to get when you want to get it at the costs that you want to pay for it. And so I think that if we really spend some time looking at logistics and the flows of freight across this country, we would sort of recognize very quickly that maybe we haven't paid as much attention to freight as we should have. It's kind of the running joke in transportation circles is that it's kind of like the redheaded stepchild of the planning universe, or it's not the source of like the cutting edge ideas all of the time. And so maybe we need to spend more time with freight and really think about how to move goods and services more efficiently in this country.
That's a great note to end on. So Tom, thank you so much for spending your afternoon with us. I really appreciate the insights. There's clearly a lot for us to keep working on. So for those following competitiveness issues and supply chain, please, you can keep an eye on BPC's website. You can also follow the Consumer Brands Association for updates on what's happening in DC in this space. So thank you all for joining us. We'll talk soon. Thanks, Tom.
Thanks.